Well, I thought we'd go for one of the real spectacular ones that people who don't live in Australia who come to visit us always can't help but exclaim. They can't believe how many parrots we've got, especially even visible right in the city, and none more so than the rainbow lorikeets. Everybody who's listening to you will know about rainbow lorikeets.
We all know them. We all, whether you want to feed them or not, they're there.
They're there, absolutely. And they always were. They are a coastal eucalypt forest bird along the coast, although they also go way inland. They have just been able to take advantage fantastically at some of the changes. So this is also one of the stories that is of a native that's done fantastically well, thank you very much. It's worth just saying in parentheses, the majority of native animals haven't done at all well in the face of urbanisation. Rainbow lorikeets have done brilliantly. And it's largely to do with our liking for planting the types of plants, types of trees and shrubs that they absolutely love, as well as feeding them. But it's really street trees and garden trees that have lots of nectar. They have a brush tongue, and they use that brush tongue to get especially pollen, which is very high levels of protein. And they also get the nectar out of a whole range of plants. And they're used to feeding on eucalypts, and to a small extent things like grevilleas and callistemons and banksias, all those sorts of things, exactly what they're adapted for. And it just so happens that those are the types of things that we like to put in our gardens in high densities.
Now, if they like the pollen from these flowering plants, does that mean they're important in the fertilisation?
Absolutely, yes. Now, we now know for a fact that they are really important in fertilising plants in the native areas. They're eating the nectar, which was what they're designed to do, but they're also distributing pollen all around the place and cross-fertilising in a really important way. So we've provided them with a huge smorgasbord of a selection of foods, and what's different about the garden environment is that there's almost always something flowering. In the bush, you have extremes of abundance and then nothing for months. And many, many animals have had to adapt to that. That's the Australian way. And it's very unpredictable in lots of cases. That unpredictability has almost vanished when you've got cities, where you've got people who plant lots and lots of native plants that flower all the time, lots of cultivars, artificial native plants, if you like, that have been specially selected to have lots of flowers and to have those flowers for a long period of time, and to flower at times when in nature they never would flower, because these things are often not doing it for reproductive reasons, they're just doing it for genetic reasons that have been selected by us because we like flowers. And the rainbow lorikeets have said, brilliant, not only do we have lots of food, but we've got it all the time.
Does that mean that before this availability was there because of people and towns, that they used to migrate?
Absolutely. And that's one of the really important things. All parrots and other species, but I'll talk about parrots, all parrots in Australia were very, very nomadic. Nomadic in the sense that they moved to places where the food was good or the conditions were good and moved on when the conditions were bad. So it's not migration as in seasonal, out in summer and winter type thing. And it's not predictable in the sense that they'll always be here at certain times. It's to do with just local conditions. So they would go into a new area, exploit the flowers that are there until they've gone, and then move on to the next patch. And there'd always be a patch somewhere. So it meant that you had influxes and then nothings and then huge eruptions of these things everywhere, and then there'd be nothing. And in fact, there'll be plenty of people listening to you who remember that that's what it used to be like. So the other thing that we've done is we've made it possible for these animals, the lorikeets, not to have to move such dramatic distances. In fact, they can settle down in a suburb in Sydney and stay there pretty much for good. They probably do very, very low-level local type movements, but there's so much food that they don't have to move. And it also means that the times of difficulty, when there's a lot less food around, the times when animals would normally be selected out, the weak ones, the old ones, the young ones that aren't necessarily going to make it, that sort of natural selection has been minimised in a huge way. So, not surprisingly, huge population growth.
Now, I see a problem here, and it's a bit like many people wanting to live in cities. It's that accommodation problem.
Absolutely. So the accommodation required by a rainbow lorikeet is a big hollow in a eucalypt tree, typically. The only problem with that is lots of other animals need those hollows. And In certain places, there is also an array of other somewhat smaller lorikeet species, such as scaly-breasted lorikeets, musk lorikeets, little lorikeets, and a whole range of other parrots, various rosellas, not to mention gliders, possums, bats, a huge array of other native animals, all seeking to use the hollows. When you've got a population explosion of one species, a native nonetheless, there is tremendous competition for those hollows. And you don't even want to throw in an introduced animal like the myna, which is then taking over the little bits and pieces that are left. So you've got an accommodation crisis. And especially when you've got council people who, the merest hint that this tree might fall over or a limb fall off, just hack them down. I would say all the cities in Australia have got a serious issue to do with the availability of decent hollows for these kinds of animals.
Well, that does beg the question, how come the lorikeet population is huge?
Because of the food that's available, because there's a lowered mortality, and also because in the array of species that I mentioned, they're big tough bullies. They can actually get in and keep all those other smaller species out. They can boot out the gliders. They tend to be winners. They're sort of street brawlers. And so they win.
Can they beat the Indian myna?
I think they can, although nobody's actually studied that in detail. The problem with the myna, and also its smaller cousin, the starling, is that they often set up shop in hollows for a lot longer than they need to. They aren't there just to breed and then leave. Some of these things set up really early and stay really late, meaning that the animals don't get a chance to move in and have it and share that space. And I know that's actually happening. In Brisbane, where there's been some studies done, the rainbow lorikeets are very successfully outcompeting the slightly smaller species, the scaly-breasted. And you can see as one population increases all the time, the other one's going down, almost certainly for the same reason.
Is this a species that will inhabit those bird boxes that people seem to think they can put out, possum boxes and so on, or will they only stick with a hollow log?
No, they do in some cases use the boxes, but not very often. There's been a fair bit of work done on boxes and which animals will use them. They will use artificial hollows, these things that if you can stick up on in a place where they're using to be a hollow. So they'll use them. Mostly, though, they tend not to use the box-style things, which we try to put up and attract wildlife. One of the reasons that rainbow lorikeets are doing so well is because, of course, they're beautiful, colourful, cheeky, spirited things, and people love to have them come to visit their feeder. So they are among a small number of birds that will feed on seed, because lots of times if you put out seed, you don't get many things native. However, lorikeets will come along. There's a huge concern that this being a pollen and nectar eater with a brush tongue, if it eats seed too much, it'll lose its brush tongue. What the people who say that don't realise is that a huge amount of the time there isn't pollen and nectar available. That's just the good times for the lorikeet. They were eating all sorts of seeds naturally anyway. So there's not any evidence, although I should say that no one's actually specifically looked at this in an individual to see whether it changes over time. But there isn't actually at the moment any evidence that they're losing their brush tongue because they're eating too much seed.
Sounds like rather rapid evolution. Or maybe they're just wearing the hairs out.
Yeah, well, it needs to be looked at.
Animals like currawongs have that natural enemy, the koel, who likes to cuckoo-eyes their nest. What about the rainbow lorikeets? Who are their predators or enemies?
Only other hawks. The cuckoos of the world almost always only lay their eggs in open nests, just a normal nest. I don't think there's a cuckoo in the world that goes into a hollow, places where parrots and lorikeets like to lay their eggs. So there's none of those. So when it comes to predators for something like a lorikeet, it's primarily hawks, or at night snakes when they're asleep, and in places where they still occur, things like quolls. Again, most mortality is on young birds. Once these things get to adult, there's not really much anything that will knock them over.
Are they long-lived?
Yeah, all Australian parrots are really long-lived. Nobody knows for absolutely sure, but there are records of at least 20, also 30 years of age.
Thank you very much, Darryl. That's Associate Professor Darryl Jones from Griffith University.